So Appgate was recognized as a leader in the 2021 Forrester Zero Trust Network Access New Wave report. This is a report authored by senior analyst David Holmes, which evaluates the 15 most significant vendors in this emerging ZTNA category. Appgate is proud to have the highest position for current offering based on a handful of differentiators identified by Forrester. We're going to break these down today with Jason Garbis. So Jason is our Chief Product Officer. He's also the co-chair of the Cloud Security Alliance Zero Trust Working Group, and he's a recently minted author of Zero Trust Security, an Enterprise Guide. If you haven't picked up this book yet and you're embarking on a zero trust journey, I highly recommend it. It's a great starting point and it's going to give you some really good insights to kind of help frame your current steps as well as what you need to think about in the future. So Jason, I want to first get your take on the ZTNA market at large. The report talks about ZTNA as a VPN replacement, a fact that really caught wind during the pandemic, as organizations were basically forced to do 100% work from home. And what we saw is that legacy VPNs, they really couldn't keep up. So what's your take on the emergence of zero trust network access over the past 12 to 24 months?
Well, George, as you pointed out very clearly, the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated gigantic shift to work from home really precipitated a lot of problems in organizations that were relying on traditional VPNs as remote access solutions, as well as accelerated adoption of ZTNA by those organizations who had started down that journey. As an enterprise providing solutions in this space, we clearly saw a lot of existing customers expand pretty dramatically in the first part and actually throughout 2020. We also saw a lot of organizations really struggle with their VPNs and shift over to ZTNA specifically for that focused VPN replacement or remote user access use case. But I think that's only one piece of the puzzle. There's some other elements of the technology environment that have I think, accelerated and really come together as the perfect storm, if you will, for why zero trust network access has been so dramatically adopted over the last year and a half. So one of them clearly is the ongoing failure of traditional security architectures and security models to protect organizations against ransomware and breaches. And it's unfortunate that this has become a nearly daily occurrence of some types of organizations are shut down because of ransomware, or there's a gigantic data breach of some sort that has impacted not just organizations, but individuals, people like all of us. We've also seen a fairly forceful and very visible role that the U.S. federal government has taken with the recent executive order from May 2021 from President Biden mandating that federal agencies and departments take a zero trust approach and put in place a real concrete timeline around them going step by step to define and appoint zero trust leaders, to define and implement a zero trust architecture. And that's really reassuring. And it has legs and impact, I think, far beyond the U.S. federal government. We've seen government and commercial entities in other countries, as well as commercial enterprises in the United States, really look at this and say, okay, this is a good excuse. This is a good opportunity for us to ride the coattails here and also go down a zero trust journey. So I think in general, those are some kind of the context around why organizations are adopting ZTNA. I think the flip side of it is that enterprises also recognize that zero trust as a security philosophy and architecture can and has been proven to be an actual business enabler, where security can now say yes to the business and help organizations take advantage of so much of the amazing new technology that's out there and really help businesses go through what can be a pretty compelling and very valuable digital transformation as they adopt new technologies, open new markets, and really embrace new types of business models. So I think all those things together really add up to a very significant sea change in the organizations, in the ecosystem around adopting zero trust.
Thanks, Jason. That helps set the stage for drilling deeper into a subset of the criteria Forrester used to evaluate ZTNA vendors in the new wave. Specifically, 6 out of 10 where Appgate holds differentiation. So let's start with deployment flexibility, where Forrester is basically evaluating whether a solution can be self-hosted on-prem, in public or private cloud environments, or consumed as a service, or even a mix of all. So Jason, this is a real simple question for you. Why is deployment flexibility such an important requirement when evaluating zero trust network access solutions?
I'm really glad that Forrester included this as the first criteria because it's a recognition that every enterprise is different. There's such a wide variety of existing networks and hardware and security infrastructure and network topologies, as well as a huge variety of strategies that enterprises have as they look forward to how are they making this digital transformation? How are they modernizing or updating their applications and their security? And where are they going? So it's a clear recognition that there is no one size fits all architecture, and that zero trust vendors, zero trust solutions need to have the ability to fit into enterprises that are 100% cloud based, or the bulk of enterprises who have a hybrid set of environments. They might have some legacy data centers that maybe they're keeping or maybe they're getting rid of. They've got probably a widely distributed set of on-premises buildings and networks and systems that are still in use, as well as a set of cloud-based services maybe that they're building out with, which are using probably a wide variety of technologies ranging from infrastructure as a service to perhaps a set of modern containerized applications. So having said all that, it's really important. And we've seen customers all over this spectrum of needing to have very precise control of where and how the network topology is set up, where the zero trust policy enforcement points are placed, and how the traffic is routed from a user device through these policy enforcement points and ultimately to the resources that they're accessing. I think it's a recognition by Forrester that for some environments, 100% on-premises deployment is appropriate and necessary. For some other environments, it would be okay to have some of the traffic routed up through a vendor cloud, for example. In some cases, they've got some very difficult and challenging network constraints that they're working to resolve, but they need to have deep networking capabilities around managing DNS, around handling overlapping IP addresses, and a lot of these nitty-gritty things that can sometimes be real blockers or impediments to a successful transition. In our solution, in Appgate SDP, we really invested in having and will continue to maintain customer choice about where and how network access network access entry points are placed, how the network traffic is routed, and ultimately giving customers control of the access mechanisms across these very messy, very heterogeneous and dynamic environments.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Zero trust, it's an idea, and how it gets applied to different environments, it's going to vary. For complex and hybrid organizations, there are no zero trust in a box solutions. The solutions, they need to be malleable to meet the varying challenges and objectives of where an organization is today, but also what are they going to be building and deploying tomorrow? So let's move on to then kind of two related criteria from the ZTNA New Wave: the ability to support non-web and legacy applications, as well as client support. Forrester is basically evaluating the ability to support all workload types and different user access requirements, i.e. deploying an agent versus accessing via an agentless type solution. Jason, do you care to elaborate on this just a little bit more?
I think these two criteria are interesting because they reflect the wide variety of the types of resources that enterprises have and need to secure access to, as well as the different types of user populations that need access into systems through zero trust access mechanism. So we think about the non-web and legacy applications. Number one, there are lots of business applications that are not and perhaps cannot be converted into web. Number one. And number two, there is also many privileged users. In fact, I'd argue that some of the most privileged users, your system administrators, utilize non-web protocols such as SSH or RDP to access systems and perform privileged system administrator type activities. So it's really important that enterprises understand that and be able to choose a ZTNA solution that can cover all their user populations and all the types of applications that are going to be accessed across lots of different protocols. From a client perspective, it's also the case that there's a wide variety of different types of users. For your employees, very often it's straightforward for organizations to mandate the installation of client-side software, whether it's the zero trust access component or additional security elements such as antivirus, for example. For third parties, however, that's often not the case. Those third parties, of course, work for enterprises of their own, and it's often the case that they've got their own security protocols and requirements, and it's difficult or impossible for the enterprise to impose that upon third parties. And that's where clientless access is also important. So we've seen, certainly our customers have situations where for most of their employees, they want to use a client-based solution because of some of the advantages of supporting deeper device posture inspection and support for a wide variety of network protocols, the ability to have server-initiated connections down to user devices, things such as that. But for a subset of users, often a very important subset, there's a need to have clientless access just using a plain vanilla web browser with no additional software installed. So there's trade-offs for both of those, but it's important for enterprises to understand that they really want to choose a ZTNA provider that has both of those capabilities in order to keep the doors open for all the different types of users accessing all the different types of resources.
Thanks, Jason. Let's move on to connector capabilities, where Forrester evaluates how a ZTNA solution routes traffic, isolates applications, enforces least privilege access, and integrates into business process workflows. Can you unpack the role and imperative of the connector for us, Jason?
When Forrester talks about connector capabilities, we should think about this from the perspective of a zero trust policy enforcement point. So a component that sits on the network and controls access from the source identity, whether it's a user or another server, to the workload or to the resource that it's attempting to access. And this connector needs to do a number of things. One, prime directive is prevent those applications from being directly exposed to the internet. Those are far too many mistakes have been made to expose RDP or Exchange servers to the internet, and we've seen the terrible results of that. One of the other elements to think about is that these connectors need to provide network level enforcement. There are some solutions out there that really rely just on authentication, and authentication is necessary but not sufficient for ZTNA. We really firmly believe that the ability to send a network packet to a workload, the ability to establish a TCP connection to a workload, to a server, is in fact a privilege and needs to be treated as such. We've seen lots and lots of vulnerabilities that can be exploited by unauthenticated users across a network. And those things simply cannot be allowed to be exposed to attackers, not just on the internet, but even malicious actors who have gotten a foothold inside an organization through something as simple as a phishing link. So we firmly believe that all network access to resources, even the ability to ping it, needs to be controlled by zero trust policy. We also think that the capabilities of the connector to tie into business processes, as Forrester calls out, is really important because we believe that in a more mature and a very successful zero trust implementation, security really becomes a byproduct of business processes. And security should be a byproduct of day-to-day operations and certainly not an impediment. And that when someone needs access to a particular resource, that it should just flow naturally for what they're doing. So a great example of that is a system administrator who has to perform activities on a given server to fix a problem or to update it. The way that should happen is that that administrator should certainly not have 24/7 by 365 access to every single server in production. In fact, they shouldn't have access to any production server until and unless there's a service desk ticket that's been assigned to that user that says, this is your task for today. You've got to apply this patch to this server over here. That ticket would be able to codify in it server IP address, the service that this user has to perform. And when that ticket is open, the zero trust system should be able to have a policy that accesses the ITSM system, evaluates that ticket, and then opens up the network pathway for that given administrator or that given administrator's team to that particular server.
Thanks, Jason. It's pretty clear how imperative the connector is when it comes to least privilege authorization and the ability to achieve fine-grained network and application segmentation. At the end, you touched there on a little bit around ecosystem integration. So let's double click down on that one. Specifically, Forrester evaluates ZTNA solution integration with identity providers, support for multi-factor authentication, and more broadly, how it supports partners, contractors, and MSSPs. Jason, I know you have some thoughts on ecosystem integration. Do you mind sharing them?
When we talk about ecosystem integration, it's important for us to consider that from the broadest possible perspective, not just integration with multiple identity providers or support for different forms of MFA. Those are really table stakes. I think it's important for enterprises to look at their full set of both IT and security infrastructures and elements that are in place, and to recognize that they've got tons of things that are out there. In fact, they probably got more than one solution in lots of different categories. And that when you go down the zero trust journey, it's really, really important to understand these touch points, both from a data and an event perspective, and to choose a ZTNA solution that has the capabilities to have both inbound and outbound APIs to exchange data, to receive events from those other types of solutions. I think that there are very, very few enterprises who have solutions only from a single vendor that are already pre-integrated. And if you look at organizations that are considering their zero trust architectures, in some cases you hear them talk about, well, I want to go for a single vendor that has an integrated suite. And the reality is that if you look at the 8 or 10 or 15 capabilities that might be on their checklist, they've probably got most, if not all of those in place in their organization in some case or another. They're probably not going to get rid of all of them. In fact, every organization we talk to says, okay, I want to keep this thing in place here. I want to replace that one over there. And the notion of buying one solution from one vendor and having to do everything is really fantasy. The reality is that organizations need to incrementally deploy a zero trust solution to be able to obtain benefits from not necessarily day one, but certainly month one, and to be able to have a strategy that says, we're going to keep this solution over here. Maybe it's our next gen firewall that we're going to use for IDS, IPS. Great. We want that tied into our zero trust solution in this way or that way. We've got a SIM over here. We're not changing that. In fact, we're going to continue to invest in that. We need our ZTNA solution to feed information into the SIM that can help it do a better job of identifying threats and activities, and to be able to take events from that SIM when it detects something anomalous is happening, and to be able to respond around that. So I think it's important for enterprises to understand the complexity of their environment and to really embrace the fact that during the zero trust journey, they need to be able to build these integrations in a way that adds value every step of the way.
This is sage advice. When I think about the integration capabilities into existing systems, the possibilities are endless. I love the perspective around unlocking and building ZTNA into the fabric of the IT security ecosystem and really unleashing more value over time. Jason, thank you for your time and all of your insight. For those of you watching, visit the URL on the screen to claim a copy of the Forrester 2021 ZTNA New Wave Report.